Welcome back to the Impact Storytelling Podcast. I'm your host, Sabine Probst-Saavedra, ocean conservation storyteller and organization director. Today, I'm joined by Natasha Benjamin, associate director at Blue Frontiers, a marine scientist, filmmaker, and ocean advocate, working at the intersection of storytelling and ocean policy. Based in Northern California, Natasha has spent over 2 decades in ocean conservation and communication. With a bachelor's in marine biology from Boston University and a master's in marine policy from the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School, she brings scientific and governance perspectives into her films. Through her documentary work, she uses storytelling to make complex ocean issues human, visible, and actionable. From disappearing kelp forests to high seas fisheries and community-driven conservation. Welcome to the podcast, Natasha. I'm happy to have you here. To begin, how did you first find your way into filmmaking and ocean conservation? And how did your marine biology and marine policy studies shape the films you make today?
Hi, Sabine. Very happy to be here today to talk about my ocean work. My kind of world into the ocean started a long time ago when I was a young girl. My father used to take me snorkeling in the Florida Keys, and I totally fell in love. I was totally hooked. I remember the first time he took me snorkeling, I wanted to talk through the whole thing and I drank so much seawater that I got sick. But I knew that, I wanted to do something with the ocean from a very, very young age. And so I grew up in New York City, but we would go down to Florida a couple times a year and get in the water. And as soon as I could get certified, scuba certified at 13, I got scuba certified and started going on dive trips with my dad. And we went all over the world and it was amazing. And I spent a lot of time in Florida and I started to see things change in the Keys. I started to see changes in the coral reefs, the fish that they used to catch. Things were changing. The corals were getting smaller, or they just weren't even there anymore. There used to be these amazing, like big brain corals and staghorn corals, and as I got older, they weren't around, and the big groupers were gone. So I knew I wanted to study marine science, and I got my undergraduate in marine biology, and then I went on to get a graduate master's program in marine policy, and started working in ocean conservation right away. So I've been doing this for a while.
Sounds like an amazing childhood upbringing, and so sad that he saw that the life declined in the reef you liked to go, like from childhood days. But great that it led you to the path that you are now on, and that you got to study thinking for marine conservation.
Yeah, I feel very lucky to do something that I'm very passionate about, that I love, and that I really care about. I feel very fortunate that I found this path.
And when did you realize that storytelling could be as powerful for conservation as science or policy?
So, relatively recently, about in the last 5 years, I just finished my first feature-length documentary, and it started really. It's about kelp forests, and it started because I am working in ocean conservation. I'm a diver. I'm a surfer. I'm spending time in the water, and I started to see things change in the ocean. I watched these kelp forest ecosystems on the coast of California here in the US disappear in a very, very short period of time. And I was shocked, and I started talking to some of the local scientists about what was going on, and everyone was really, really shocked. And about 5 years ago, when I kind of started this journey on this film, there hadn't been a film about the kelp forests in Northern California here, documenting what was going on and how it was impacting people. And I was actually having lunch with my father, who is a filmmaker, in addition to the one who introduced me to the ocean. He's a documentary filmmaker. And we were having lunch with Anna Blanco, who's the director of the International Ocean Film Festival. And I was talking about what was going on with the kelp and this perfect storm of events that had caused this huge decline, 95%. We lost 95% of the underwater forests. And um, and so I was telling my father the story, and I was asking Anna if there had been any films, and she said there hadn't been any films about what was going on. And my father looked at the two of us and said, "You two should make a film." So that's how it started. And I had never made a film. I had done some, short videos. Always been, always had the camera. I was always the person with the camera, but I wasn't a filmmaker. And both my parents were filmmakers, and I kind of wanted to have nothing to do with that. But went on this journey to make this film about kelp forests here in Northern California. And along the way, really realized that it's one of the most powerful tools that we have to tell these stories and to reach larger audiences. If you can tell a kind of impactful human interest story, you might be able to reach people that we normally don't reach in the ocean conservation community. So I'm now realizing the power, and I'm really excited to use this new skill that I have to tell ocean stories.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard about the issue with the kelp in Northern California. Like I read about it a couple years ago, and it was really sad. I mean, not only there is a problem with the abundance in kelp, but also in other places. And I just love marine plants. So we just published a reel about kelp in the UK today from my organization. So it was really exciting to see that you did a film about kelp as well.
Yeah, I was not a kelp or seaweed person before. I was more of a fish
Oh,
person. And I am totally like, I've got the kelp fever, and it's all about kelp now.
yeah. Yeah, I think for me it started the first time also during in a kelp forest in the UK. And then just every little algae and seaweed just started interested me. Yeah.
Yep. It's in a really, really critical ecosystem, and it's not just in California that we're losing kelp.
Mm,
It's happening
yeah.
all over the world, and that's why it's so important.
Yeah. Sadly. And yeah, scientists often communicate through reports and data. What do you think that film can do that science communication alone cannot?
Yeah, I mean, I think, after working kind of in the crosshairs of the science and policy world for 25 years, and working with lots of different agencies and government agencies and research institutions, I realized that we spend a lot of time talking to each other, uh, and scientists tend not to be the best at distilling that information and trying and making it accessible to the public. And that's, most researchers, that's not their job. They're doing the research, they're publishing papers, and it's going back into the scientific community, and it's building that science that we need for sure. But there's such a need for taking the science and the policy and making it accessible to the public. I think land-based conservation, has been kind of more, people understand land issues much more readily because they can see it. Most people are not in the water, don't get to see these underwater ecosystems, these underwater forests. And as this, within the scientific community, we need to do a much better job telling those stories, and not just charts and numbers and data, but really how the changing ocean is affecting communities, is affecting ocean health, and that's our job as communicators, is to tell those stories.
Yeah. Yeah, that's also what I realized a couple of years ago when I started doing documentary films for ocean conservation. that the science is not really going out of the science field or or is understandable to the general public. So that's why I started working with scientists for films as well, to make it understandable that way through the films. And I think with the ocean, it's also not that we don't see it, because at the beach at least, it's visible, but people just don't know what they're seeing and what is normal and what is an animal, what is a plant. So I think that's another problem, because on land, we do realize that's a sponge, that's a tree, that's an animal. But in the water, I think because we don't know so much about it, it's harder for us to understand.
Right. And it looks fine from the surface, right? Like from the surface, the ocean looks great, but we need to take people below the surface and show them what's happening, the beauty and the problems, both.
And in your role at Blue Frontier, you also work with policy and civic engagement. Have you seen films influence decision makers or public action?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of great examples of powerful films that have brought awareness to an issue and then also created an impact campaign where there was, real policy change. Um, the first one that comes to mind is The Cove, which was about what was happening with dolphins in Japan, the slaughter of dolphins in Japan, and that really opened up the world's eyes to what was happening to marine mammals, and had some real policy change. Chasing Coral is another great example of a film that brought huge attention to coral, and has kind of had this last and was so beautiful, like, visually, fascinating to watch. Um, and I think, really stuck with people, and really on the awareness building and, why these ecosystems are so important and how they're being impacted by climate change. And then another favorite is Octopus Teacher, which was, to me, I was like, okay, if you can, the kelp was the main character, besides the octopus, the kelp forest was the main character in some ways, and that people were fascinated with that film, and that gave me a lot of hope that there was kind of room for these ocean films to create awareness and then build policy changes around them. And back to the coral, one of the things that we're realizing in the kelp world is, people understand coral. Most people have seen coral, they've seen videos, they've seen films, or they've been snorkeling in a coral reef. But there's very few people that have actually experienced a kelp forest. And we kind of feel like now is coral has had its time, and still there's tremendous work that needs to happen, but now is kind of kelp's turn. Kelp is the new coral in terms of bringing awareness and talking about these really important ecosystems.
Yeah, I think corals still have a bit of more appeal as well, because they're colorful. And algae, when you touch it, it's a bit slimy, it's brown mostly. So yeah, we need to make some more awareness around it, how important it actually is. Yeah, I'm already hooked, so which is I need to hook the other people too. Yeah. Yeah, besides those big films, there are a lot of smaller films as well that are directly made for impact, where the impact campaign is designed first, and then the films are done, like the Net Geo Impact Lab specifically just does like impact campaign films for certain projects, which is amazing.
Yeah, and I think those, I mean, having your campaign really built and then creating a film to create that awareness is really critical, and it's such an amazing tool to use for policymakers, for creating awareness, for kind of, building that campaign. Our film Sequoias of the Sea wasn't, it was more of a story that we wanted to tell. But now we're building an impact campaign with it, really to create awareness around the kelp issue.
That's great. And what ethical responsibilities do you feel towards the communities whose livelihoods depend on the ocean?
So, with Sequoias of the Sea, the film about kelp that we just finished, we wanted to tell a kelp story, and we realized along the way that we ended up really telling a community story, and how the community has been impacted by what's happening with the kelp. And I think as storytellers, as filmmakers, we have a huge responsibility to accurately tell people's stories, to work with them, to make sure we're representing what's happening. And these in the kelp story here in Northern California, communities have been greatly impacted by losing their underwater ecosystem. So you have the fishermen, and you have the tribal communities, the indigenous communities, you have the scientists, and then the local communities. You have all these different kind of groups that we worked with and showed in the film. And it took 4 years to make the film and to tell the story. So you end up building relationships with these folks. And it was, there was the hardest part about telling these stories and doing an accurate representation is there's just too much. There's like, you have to, at the end of the day, you have to edit an hour and a half long film, and you can't tell all of the pieces. I could have made 5 films. But it was fascinating to be able to come into these people's world and see what was happening on the ground there.
Yeah, I think it's always amazing to work with the people that are local and that know the problems firsthand and listen to them also how the film needs to be made to create an impact to tell the story right and just coming from the outside and thinking to know how to tell it, but then actually talking the vehicle and seeing what's needed and what's the actual point. And when you start a project, do you begin with the science, the characters, or the place?
With Sequoias of the Sea, it started with an issue. We've lost 95% of our kelp, and people need to know about this. And this is really important, and this is shocking. Like, we've never seen this kind of loss before. So it started with that, and then it really evolved into identifying the hotspot of where, kind of the epicenter of where the loss was happening, which was on the Sonoma and Mendocino coast in California, in Northern California. And then it evolved into who are the best people to tell this story, and who's doing the work, and who is being impacted. So it was kind of an evolution of issue, location, and characters.
And as you already said, you spend time with fishermen, tribal members, and scientists. What perspective did each group bring to understanding the crisis?
Well, I think what's really unique about this kelp story is you have these 3 groups: the fishermen, the tribal members, and the scientists working together, which doesn't always happen. Usually, and one of the lines in the film is usually fishermen and scientists are kind of butting heads and on opposite ends. Or the conservation community and fishermen also. Although in California, there's a lot of amazing examples of commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen working with the conservation and science communities. And I think we're seeing that more and more all over the world, just really out of necessity because our oceans are changing. And fishermen whose livelihood depend on a healthy ocean are you're being hugely impacted. So it was really a beautiful story of them coming together, and that's where it's a story of grief of losing this 95% of this ecosystem, but it's also a story of hope, of a community coming together and crossing these lines that sometimes don't get crossed, to come together to work to try to figure out how to bring back the kelp, and also really think about how these communities have to shift. Like, our oceans are changing. The resources that we've depended on for decades don't exist anymore. And fishermen and tribal communities are having to shift the way they've done things in the past and work towards this kind of new blue economy, is what a lot of communities are calling it. So, it was really interesting to watch that evolve.
Yeah, and 95% is a crazy number to lose such a huge amount of kelp ecosystems. And that must have had huge consequences on everything around it. For the listeners unfamiliar with kelp ecosystems, can you tell them why kelp forests are considered such a foundational marine habitat?
Yes. So, kelp forests are kind of like the homes and the cities underwater where everyone lives and everyone hangs out and everyone's protected from the weather and the storms. So it's the nursery ground, it's the home, it's the grocery store, it's everything for these coastal ecosystems. And in addition, they protect coastlines from erosion and from storms. They also sequester carbon and buffer ocean ecosystems. And without them, you lose that infrastructure completely. And there's been this kind of cascading domino effect of different other ecosystems and other organisms that depend on it. And here in California, what happened about 10 years ago, we had this perfect storm of ocean conditions that caused this collapse. And it was climate driven, warm water, where we had warm water. Kelp needs cold, nutrient rich water. And when we had this warm water in 2013-14, which was called the warm water blob, where temperatures much, much higher, the kelp died off and purple sea urchins took over. So these are native urchins that live in the kelp forest in balance. But when we lost the kelp and that we had that warm water, the purple urchins took over and exploded. And then we also, at the same time, there was a disease that killed off all the sea stars along the west coast of America, and including the sunflower sea star, which is the main predator of the purple urchin on the north coast of California. So we now have no predators for the purple urchin. And it caused this dramatic shift of losing kelp forests, purple urchins taking over. Now, when you go diving, there's no more kelp, there's no more canopy, and it's just this desert, this carpet of these little purple sea urchins everywhere. And it's really devastating to see what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great example to show what an imbalance in the ocean ecosystem can look like, or if the predators fall out and others will overtake, and what then happens. Don't the sea otters eat sea urchins as well?
They do. And, so 150 years ago along the West Coast, we hunted sea otters basically to almost to extinction. And they were able to come back in Monterey and Central California. We have slowly brought back some of the sea otter populations, but they never came back to the North Coast. So we don't. So that would have been another predator in the system, in addition to these big sunflower sea stars. People used to call them starfish. Now we call them sea stars because they're not fish. And so on the North Coast, it's quite unique. On Southern California and other areas, they have predators. They have otters, they have lobsters, they have sheephead, which are big fish that eat urchins. But in Northern California, there's no more predator. And that's the big issue. And there are efforts to bring back the sunflower sea star. They were able to, they had, when they disappeared 10 years ago, or a little bit less than 10 years ago, there were some sea stars in captivity in aquariums. And so they're using those, they're rearing them and breeding them to hopefully reintroduce them into the wild. And there's also talk of trying to relocate otters from like more central California to Northern California. But that's very controversial, bringing back the otters, because otters eat a lot, and they'll eat healthy urchins, but they'll also eat mussels and crabs and abalone and other things that are really important to communities on the North Coast. So It's a tough one. We know that having otters in the ecosystem is really important. And if we had otters, then this collapse might have not been as bad. Um, when you have a balanced, healthy ecosystem with keystone predators, that keeps the system more resilient when things change. But bringing back the otters is going to be a tricky one.
Yeah. And how has the loss of kelp affected coastal communities socially, economically, and culturally?
In so many ways. So, without kelp in the ecosystem, um, the fisheries that depend on the organisms, the critters in the ocean that depend on kelp are suffering, and they're suffering, and then the fisheries that depend on those fish and invertebrates are also suffering. So it's kind of this domino effect. In the past, there in the North Coast or in California, there used to be a really big red urchin fishery, commercial fishery. When you go to a Japanese restaurant and you order uni, that's red urchin. And when the kelp collapsed and the purple urchins took over, the red sea urchin fishery collapsed. So all of the fishermen up on the North Coast really like have lost their livelihoods in a very impactful way, and a lot of them are now working on restoration diving to remove the purple sea urchins. In addition, the abalone, which is a big part of California's tradition, in the past, commercial fishery, recreational fishery, and of course the tribal take of abalone. The tribes use the abalone for food, for ceremony, for regalia. It's a huge part of their tradition. And since we lost the kelp, the abalone eat kelp. And when the kelp was gone, that meant the abalone were starving. And they shut down the fishery. The tribes are not allowed to take any more abalone. And have lost the tradition of teaching the next generation how to harvest this abalone and use it. So they've been tremendously impacted. And there's the kelp also supports all of these other fisheries, rockfish that live in the kelp and use them as nursery grounds. So we're still trying to starting to see the consequences of losing this ecosystem. It's just the beginning. A lot of these species live for decades, so it's going to take a while to really see the impact on some of the rockfish populations that can live many, many years.
And how fast are the sea urchins reproducing?
So they're everywhere if you go in the water. What's crazy is they can basically live. They can go into this kind of hibernation state where they don't need any food, and they can stay like that for decades. So they're like these zombie urchins that are empty. So there's nothing inside them. They're not like there's no uni, there's no gonads, but they're still alive. And when the food comes back, they come back to life. So, everyone's like, why don't you just go get all these purple sea urchins and eat them or sell them or, do something with them? But they're empty, most of them. They're starving because there's no food, and they can stay like that. So that's a big problem. So they're in order to do the restoration work, you have to do two things. You got to remove these urchins, and then you also have to be able to introduce kelp back into the ecosystem. And this is where a lot of groups on the North Coast, all along the coast really, are working. There's amazing work being done, and it's kind of amazing. We've never restored a kelp ecosystem on the West Coast before. In Korea, they've done a lot of kelp restoration, but this was new science. Like we didn't really know how to do this at the beginning, and we've learned a tremendous amount over the last 10 years.
And what restoration efforts gave you the most hope while filming?
Yes, so it was amazing to watch what was happening in Mendocino, which is a town along the Mendocino coast. There's a small town, and they have the Nature Conservancy and local fishermen and Reef Check, which is another organization that has citizen divers helping with restoration and assessing and monitoring, and the tribes are all working together along in this little area. And in this one spot, Big River, which is right in the town of Mendocino, they removed urchins with the commercial fishermen. Grant Downey is one of the main fishermen that's in the film and that is working on this project. They removed urchins and then they started planting kelp on structures above the urchins so that the urchins couldn't eat the kelp. So it's like a structure that comes up above, and then the baby kelps are planted on these lines above the ground, above the seafloor. And they saw 900% increase in kelp over 2 or 3 years in that one specific area, which is really remarkable and really exciting and giving kind of the restoration community a lot of hope. It took a while. They were focused on removing urchins at the beginning, and then they realized, they knew, like, if there's no kelp in the system, if there's no kelp spores, then the kelp's never going to come back. So they needed to put kelp and do kelp enhancement in addition to removing the urchins.
Oh, it sounds like an amazing success in that area. Are they looking to implement it in the other areas now as well?
Yes, I think they're starting to look at new sites. And then there's also the National Marine Sanctuaries here on the west coast of California. We have the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. They're also doing restoration efforts and they're working together. So doing similar efforts further south, kind of closer to San Francisco. And they're also seeing tremendous results in the areas where we're doing restoration. The issue is that we're looking at a stretch of 300 kilometers, and these are teeny little pinpoints along the map. But kelp, the interconnectedness between these areas, we're hoping we kind of create this network where kelp can kind of flow through these systems and reestablish along the entire coast. So it's happening from San Francisco, up towards Northern California, but it's a slow process and we need more funding and we need more people doing this work.
Oh, let's hope that it goes well, that there will come more funding and more people will hear about it and wants to help with the project. And you've done another film as well. So Further from the Coast unfolds another story that you have worked on, The Fatal Watch. It highlights marine observers monitoring fish vessels. For those who do not know what marine observers are, can you for the start tell us what they do?
Yes. So this is another film project that I've worked on called Fatal Watch, which is about fisheries observers or marine observers. Most people don't know what they are, but these are the people that are on the boat that are supposed to be neutral, watching what's happening on these big kind of industrial, large scale commercial fishing boats. They are supposed to record and monitor and kind of be a third party check and balance on what is the fishing company is actually bringing in. So when these big industrial boats go out, they're usually targeting a species, but they also end up bringing in bycatch and other fish. And the fishery observers on the boats are supposed to be recording that information. And the film is about there's been stories of many of these observers that go missing or actually die on the boat, and pretty horrific stories of what's happening on some of these industrial fishing boats around the world, especially off the coasts in Asia and Africa. And these are, these are fishing boats that are catching massive amounts of tuna and other pelagic fish. And it's a really tragic story of of overfishing, and really this humanitarian story of like people that are, they're trying to observe and report, and people don't like what they're seeing, and then they're disappearing. So this is a human story and an environmental story of industrial overfishing that most people don't know about, and don't realize that when you order tuna, or you get that can of tuna, kind of the what it took to get that piece of fish.
Yeah. I had a similar conversation in one of my first podcast episodes, but it was about people, as you said, like from Asia or from Africa, where they get offered a job to work on a fishing vessel, and they got told that they will get a good salary and they can support their families that are staying there. And then they're going on that ship, their passport gets taken away, they have to stay in the ship, and yeah, they get treated really horribly, oftentimes not coming back home anymore. Um, yeah, and usually the captains or the vessels belong to richer countries, and then everyone else that is from a different nationality or from a lower income country gets treated really horribly and often go missing, as you said in your story as well.
It's not just the fishery observers that go missing, but it's the crew on the boat that are sometimes they're held against their will at sea, and there's a whole slavery at sea issue in conjunction with this kind of corrupt fishing industry, corrupt fishing industry. So it's a big story. This film started a long time ago. It's actually a project that I worked on with my father. He's the director and the executive producer of the film,
Mhm.
along with Katie Carpenter, the other co-director, and he had been working on a number of a series on kind of crimes against the ocean called Ocean Warriors, and then that turned into another film called Chasing the Thunder, about fishing down in the Southern Ocean, Patagonian toothfish with sea shepherd, and illegal fishing operations in the Southern Ocean, and just wanting to continue to tell the stories around this industrial overfishing crime that's going on, that most people, this is happening far, far away from where we are here, in Europe and America. And it's happening in the middle of the ocean, and there's very little regulation. There's very little ability to regulate, to track, to monitor these vessels that are basically staying at sea for years at a time, and doing transshipping, taking their cargo and offloading it at sea, so they're never coming into port. And this is what's happening for most of the fish that we consume, that's being transported all over the country. So we wanted to tell this kind of unseen, again, an unseen ocean story that's happening really far away off the coast. And most people are not thinking about where their fish comes from and what it takes to get, on their plate. So trying to create some transparency, and also create policies to protect these observers that really, like, they're at the mercy of the captain, and they're living with the crew, and it's very dangerous conditions. But the observer story is a really important one, but it's also a way to shed light on what's happening in these industrial fishing scenarios that are happening offshore.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if people think about where their fish comes from, then they think more about the impact on environment. But I think really almost nobody probably knows what's going on with the crew on the ship and the impacts that that's having there. So I think it's great to share that in the film as well.
Yep, exactly. The human piece of the story is really important. And a lot of, like the Monterey Bay Seafood Watch program, it really started to give recommendations on which seafood you should eat. And it was really only based on environmental issues. Now they've incorporated kind of the human and social side of the fisheries and what's happening. But that's a newer piece of the ocean conservation kind of seafood story.
And what surprised you most about what actually happens on the high seas apart from enforcement?
I mean, there were a lot of quite shocking things. I think one of the biggest issues is the overlap between the fishing industry and the regulatory bodies, and the kind of the gray area, and the lack of separation between who's actually regulating the fisheries. And it's when you start looking at who is sitting on the regulatory bodies, there there's so much commercial, industrial fishing representation that is intertwined in the regulations. And obviously, we know that that doesn't work. And that whole system needs to change. And that's going to take tremendous work to separate what's happening. And people are not allowed to sit at the table. Conservation groups, communicators, filmmakers, we got kicked out of meetings. They wouldn't let us film. They don't want us to know what's happening behind these closed doors in terms of making regulations. And that is a huge issue that a lot of groups, Greenpeace, Sea Shepherd, Paul Watson Foundation, are really trying to give a voice to the ocean, to the conservation community, and to these people that are working on these boats that don't get a voice.
Hmm.
So there's a tremendous amount of work to be done on that front.
And how is global seafood demand connected to the risks of these observers?
Yeah, most of the seafood that's coming from these areas is getting shipped all over the world, and one of the things that's happening too is they're starting to change towards electronic monitoring and not having people on boats anymore. And there's pros and cons to having these cameras basically that are watching and observing and using AI to actually to try to identify what fish are coming up in the net and monitoring all that information. So there's a lot of work on trying to have more monitoring place, but also removing the human element. And I think that's a complicated one when you've got just cameras, because people can turn them off, people can put something in front of them. These tracking systems are not people. You can get around them. So without having a human on the boat, it's a big issue. But I think the big picture is, and this goes with all food systems, is these industrial food systems are not working. They, when we're using so much energy to produce food and then ship it around the world, like we can't continue to do things like that. So I think, ultimately it's thinking about focusing on local products, local seafood in your territorial waters, not having countries like China and some of these big industrialized countries coming into poor countries along the African coast and clearing out their seafood and then shipping it to China and the US. That's, our ocean can't handle that. And that's not the way we want to be doing things. So that's something we're trying to shed light on is, trying to change the way that we eat wild seafood. We should be eating locally, and we shouldn't be going into other people's waters and depleting their resources that they need.
I guess that also then makes the next problem for the local fishermen, that if all the huge fishing vessels are going there and taking everything out, then how shall the local smaller fishermen get the food that they actually need, because they cannot go far away to get their food?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And what changes in monitoring policy or public awareness are, in your opinion, most urgently needed?
So bringing attention to the safety issues for these observers is a big part of, we're working with a number of different groups on that. Also looking at federal fishery policies here in the US, and then internationally in all these regional fishery management councils. The science is really important. I mean, this goes back to, we need the science. We need to understand what's happening with these fish populations. But the science within the management systems is, again, there's this like gray area where you've got industry representation that's funding the science or actually doing the science, and it's messy and it's not clear. Tuna is a big one. I mean, you talk to some people and they're like, tuna's doing great, tuna's sustainable, we're managing it really well. But then you look at the numbers of how much they're taking out of the system, and it's not sustainable, and it's huge amounts. One of the big push also is around marine protected areas and closing big areas of the ocean to fishing. And there's a lot of argument of, there's scientists that are saying we should close the high seas, which is each country has territorial waters around 200 miles offshore. And then there's the high seas, which is this kind of no man's land where most of this fishing happens. And if we close that to commercial fishing and just focused on our territorial waters, we would reduce the carbon footprint of these ships that are going all around the world, and local territories would focus on their resources. I think we know we need to close certain areas to fishing, but then there's this huge issue of regulation. Who's going to watch it? Who's going to stop them? You can have these paper MPAs declaring areas to no fishing areas, these, what we're calling underwater parks. But if there's no enforcement, then what do they mean? And we've seen that in the Pacific. But this idea of protecting 30% of our oceans by 2030, which is soon, this is a global initiative to protect 30%. It's called the 30 by 30. Is really important to think about how we're going to get that and how we're going to enforce it. So a lot of groups are working on that, and we're thinking about how to bring awareness around that.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a monitoring issue. I cannot see how they would try to monitor the high seas if it's not even possible for the MPAs, not for all places, especially at night. So I think, maybe it needs more technology like satellites that can see really well at night as well, and then of course the enforcement, as you said, because even if it's monitored and there is proof that something maybe illegal happened, if they're going there without being allowed, then there needs to be some consequences for that as well. But I think there's also a lot of work still to be done. And moving on to another story that you sent me about a young woman. What drew you to document Catherine Breed's 900-mile swim along the Californian coast?
Yes, so totally shift gears from industrial overfishing to a beautiful story. This is hopefully my next project. Is a story about Catherine Breed, who is going to swim the entire coast of California from the Oregon border to the Mexican border this summer 2026, in July. And she wants to use the swim to elevate ocean conservation stories along the way. And I met Catherine last year. I was showing Sequoias of the Sea, and she saw the film, and she came up to me afterwards and she said, I want to know more about the kelp. I had no idea that this was happening, and I'm doing this swim, and I want to tell the kelp story in conjunction with my swim. And she told me that, she was going to swim 900 miles and do this, this really incredible journey. And my first question to her was, who's making the film? and and she said, funny you should ask. We're looking for a director. So I started, she was working with a couple other producers that I've started to work with, and we're in kind of development, pre-production. They're planning this amazing swim. There will be a boat. She will be swimming like 10 to 12 miles a day, and then stopping at 16 ports along the way. And we are identifying different kind of ocean issues. The kelp forest, obviously, is one of them. What's happening with whales and whale migrations and whales getting hit by ships and ship strikes and food issues around whales. We're seeing a lot of mortality around whales in California. And then we're going to be looking at oil drilling in Southern California and all along the coast of California. We're going to be looking at coastal erosion and water quality issues. We're going to be looking at shark research, some of the the great white shark patterns that are happening here in California. So we're starting to identify these different kind of really important California coastal stories and tell those stories through this incredible sporting event at the same time. And I'm really, really excited about this project. And Catherine is amazing, and she is taking on this epic adventure, and it's very, very exciting.
Yeah, it definitely sounds very exciting. I'm looking forward to watching it when it's done. And so she's swimming these 900 miles. What do you think will be the biggest challenges of filming that in the water?
So we are planning to have a camera person on the boat with Kat. It won't be the same person for the 4 months of this. It's going to take 4 months to do this swim. Um, and obviously, we're going to be filming on the boat and in the water. Um, there's a lot of unknowns. The ocean, the conditions along California are really unpredictable, and the North Coast is going to be rough. And from Oregon border kind of down to north of San Francisco, there's this long stretch where there's nowhere to come into port. It's called the Lost Coast, and kind of that northern part. There's nowhere to anchor. There's nowhere to come in if there's weather or issues. So once she gets through that, I think everyone will be able to breathe. But we are going to try to cover as much as we can. A lot of it is just going to be swimming, and there's only so much swimming we can show in a film. But we want to record everything because you don't want to miss the whale breaching behind her, or the time she bumps into a seal or whatever it is. So we're going to be trying to capture everything we can, and then obviously editing it down. But there's an enormous amount of planning that's going into what is the best gear to have, who is the best person to have on the boat, and how we're going to kind of piece this whole thing together and come in, when she comes into these ports, try to be as effective as possible with everyone's time to meet with these different organizations and have Catherine really exploring some of these issues and follow Catherine's journey of, she's calling this her love letter to the California coast. She is an ocean lover. She wants to protect the ocean and, use this swim as a way to tell these stories.
Yeah, sounds amazing. Are you gonna have one boat or more following her?
Well, she's going to have a sailboat that's following her, and the crew will be living on the boat. She'll have a kayaker in the water with her at times. And then we hope to have a secondary boat in certain locations where we can do some more filming and have more people kind of following her. So we're trying to figure all of that out.
And how will the film connect endurance sport, women's empowerment, and ocean conservation in a meaningful way?
So, telling Catherine's story, not just, how she got to this place. She's an endurance athlete. She's been, she is has been doing swim competitions since she was, I don't even know, I think 4 years old is what her mom told me. And so telling kind of her personal story of how she got to this place, and why the ocean and these stories are so important to her. I mean, as someone who spends time in doing, open water swimming, the health of the ocean is obviously really important. And she just completed a swim from the Farallon Islands to the Golden Gate Bridge, which only I think 7 people have done in the world, and she beat the record for men and women on time. And we got to document that, and it was incredible to see just the mental and physical journey that she has to go through to do like a 15-hour swim through the night, through very, very sharky waters. And so I think this story is really going to be a story of Catherine, her personal journey, this physical endeavor, and then this incredible coast and the beauty and also the danger. We've got sharks, we've got aggressive sea lions, we've got jellyfish that are no joke, and just for 4 months swimming day after day, what that takes to do, and kind of how you feel at the end of it. So it's going to be a mix of this kind of personal journey and then this beautiful along the beautiful California coast.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how it turns out, the whole journey, and how she will feel afterwards. And across all your projects, what message about relationship with the ocean feels most important to communicate for you right now?
Um, I think people get so overwhelmed at like, what can I do? How, I'm just one person. How can I make a difference? And we've seen time and time again when individuals come together and make a stand and change their behavior and demand change, change can happen. So I think one of the biggest takeaways from all the work that I do is that we can all make a difference, and we have to. We have to change the way we're doing things. And we need to create the political will here in America and globally to change the system. And we have to do it for ourselves, the next generations, and the generations to follow. We've screwed things up pretty bad, and I have 2 kids, and I think about the legacy that we're leaving them, and this kind of insane situation that we're in right now in terms of environmental protections. Yesterday's news on what the U.S. administration is doing in terms of dismantling so many things that we've built. So we're not giving up. And we, as individuals, we can make a difference, and we need to remember that.
Yeah. And if you could leave listeners with one final thought or invitation to act, what would you want them to do?
To speak up, call your representatives, write a letter, get involved, volunteer. There's so many different organizations. Go to sequoiasofthesea.org. We have a take action page. The kelp story is a climate story, so this applies to everyone. It's not just here in Northern California. And do something. Don't just watch and complain, but do something and get involved.
It's a great last message. And I'm really looking forward to watch your new film when it's done. And you're welcome to come back with new projects to talk about in the future. Thank you so much for sharing your work and those amazing stories. And yeah, hope to see you soon again.
Thank you so much, Sabine. This was a pleasure.